Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. Yes, this is a really good question. You guys are so sharp. I mean, I just love looking at your comments and the questions that you have. Here it is. A viewer asks, why during the heyday of the period performance boom in the 1980s and early 90s, when it seemed almost universally frowned upon by many in the musical establishment for modern orchestras to play works of the baroque or classical periods, did that ethos never seem to extend to instrumental pieces of the same period? There was plenty of critically acclaimed cycles of Mozart and Beethoven piano sonatas played on a modern Steinway during this time, even Bach and Scarlatti, and none seemed to make the critics protest their lack of authenticity. Why? Well, that is an absolutely fabulous question because it's true. I mean, it's undeniably true. And you know, I never even thought of it that way, but you're right. I'm just shocked, and it really got me to thinking. That's a very, very interesting comment. I have a few observations. The first is that a lot of critics have no clue what they're doing and really should not even be in the business. That's the truth. The level of criticism, the quality of criticism is horrible. It's a dying art form. I've said that for years and years and years. And that's one issue. Don't trust all the critics, with certain exceptions, like moi, but otherwise, Anyway, but seriously, we have to make a distinction between what we see going on, the tip of the iceberg, and what's going on below. The mass of musical activity happening in the universe. The people who got the most attention in the period instrument movement when it was, at its height, were people who had ensembles, orchestras, because it was orchestras that sounded most different, number one. Number two, they were reclaiming a lot of repertoire. You have to remember that modern ensembles, when they played classical or baroque pieces, did very, very few. I mean, they did a Brandenburg concerto here or there, or maybe a Mozart, one of Mozart's last three symphonies, or a Haydn symphony if you were lucky. And Beethoven, of course, was always done, but even then, the earlier ones, not so much. There was a very select repertoire, whereas these people were recapturing the whole era and creating an entirely different sound for that era, which was very exciting. It really was. And so for people who were starting to have a more comprehensive view, the modern interpretive style, with very few exceptions, Bernstein's Haydn and some other people like that, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big part of their repertoire. Their claim on that was almost one of sort of condescension, a historical, lèse majesté or something like that. One of those, well, yes, we'll do this classical stuff, but we're really not suited for it. And Mozart's late symphonies aside, really, that's where the repertoire started. Even Haydn was, already sort of on the way out. Modern ensembles did it, but they didn't do it with the kind of proprietary sense of ownership. And so the period instrument people, stepped into the breach and claimed ownership, and they did it very successfully. So, that's one answer to why the instrumental, the orchestral aspect of it was so prominent. But when it comes to the other thing, solo playing and whatnot, well, that's very interesting. That's more interesting to me because I think the orchestral part is rather easily dealt with. The other part is much more fascinating. And here's the bottom line. We have to make a distinction between two types of performers, violinists and keyboardists. They have slightly different trajectories. So let's talk about violinists. The most dramatic changes in performance technique and sonority and timbre and sound came in the string sections. Everything else was just a function, basically, of mechanical improvements made over time. But it wasn't a question of like an oboe not sounding like an oboe, or a trumpet not sounding like a trumpet. We always had piccolo trumpets, could play the high screamy Baroque things. You can play them on natural trumpets. Do they sound that different? Not really. But violins, that was a huge thing, because there were vast schools of violin playing with pedigrees going back a gazillion years. And here's the bottom line. There has never been a period instrument violinist who will ever be as successful as a great normal violinist, ever, for any reason, no matter what. Exclamation point, period. And the reason is really very simple. The reason is because they can't play romantic repertoire. They can't play the music that everyone wants to hear on the violin. Yes, people want to hear the Bach sonatas and partitas, and sometimes you want to hear them played on a Baroque violin, but there are no Baroque violinists who have played the Bach sonatas and partitas who will ever be as successful as Arthur Grumio or Hitzcock Perlman, or, you just make your list. First of all, they're better. These violinists were just amazing violinists. And second of all, it's a question of tone and timbre and the ability to subsume a sufficient amount of violin repertoire to have a major career, a career worth documenting, something that people will pay to go hear. And no period instrument violinists have ever had that. Sure, there's been Monica Huggett and Vera Bess, and Andrew Mancy could maybe have been one, but he gave it up, and now he's a conductor. And for good reason. Yes, you could spend the rest of your life playing Leclerc violin sonatas, but who's going to go hear them? I mean, you cannot make a career out of it that's going to have an international sort of following. It just ain't going to happen. Remember, there was Giulio Carmignola, the guy who was on Sony Vivarte. He's a wonderful violinist, and he plays Baroque instruments. But, some people play both. Peter Vispove, who plays Baroque cello and modern cello, but you have to have the modern part. You can't just specialize in that limited range of repertoire. There are only so many people who care about Bieber's Rosary Sonatas, beautiful as they are, and they are. And, I remember Pinchas Zuckerman. Remember his incredibly scatological and angry interview in Fanfare magazine, where he was cursing and carrying on. But what he basically said was, he ran into a period instrument person, and she had her violin screwed up tight and was playing without vibrato. He said, I can make any sound she makes, but why would I want to? Why would anybody want to? That was his point. That's where the real question of taste comes into it. And it's an impossibility. As long as you have great modern violinists who have the entire romantic violin concerto repertoire and sonata repertoire at their fingertips, you will find occasionally decent performances amongst those folks of later music, but it's rare. And these people are not going to have major careers. They don't. So that's an interesting phenomenon. So you're on the outs with the string people. We've seen now string quartets that play period style. Most of them sound absolutely vile and revolting, but they do it, and presumably people go to see it, and some of it gets recorded. But chamber music is and those things are such a small niche of a niche. And period instrument chamber music is a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche. And you can only, push it so far. Whereas large ensembles are big and splashy, and they have a more a larger cachet and a larger following, at least in the recorded business. Of course, lots of these people, you remember the difference between recordings and the mass of musical activity at the level of mere performance, not recording, not preserving what they're doing, is enormous. I mean, there's zillions of people who can fill a small room with their buddies, or pop up at a festival and show up in a limited engagement sort of thing. But you're going to fill up Carnegie Hall, you're going to fill up the major establishments with a period violin. All by yourself? And maybe a little tinkly thingy behind you? Not so much. Happens, but not so much. Then we have to talk about keyboard players. Well, the keyboard situation is really very, very interesting because here you're dealing with piano versus forte piano to a degree. And then piano versus harpsichord. Now, the harpsichord is a whole nother universe. It's a whole nother group of players. They're a minority among keyboard players. It's very interesting, but we all know there's nothing new, frankly, for the authenticity movement in the keyboard universe to tell us in gross terms. Yes, you can argue about whether it's a Flemish harpsichord or a Rooker's harpsichord or an Italian thing or or whether Cristofori made the pianoforte, or you can get into as much silly detail as you want, and I have a story about that which I can tell you in a minute. But essentially, there's nothing new there. Everybody knows that Bach wrote for the harpsichord. And we still talk about Wanda Landowska playing Bach on the harpsichord. I mean, it's been known for over 100 years. And there have always been excellent harpsichordists who specialized in that instrument. Ralph Kirkpatrick, back in the day. And then there were, just as today, there are forte pianists, and they make such a fuss. Oh, they make such a fuss. Here's the story. I'll tell you the story. It's a funny story. When Hensler Classic was making their CPE Bach edition, I had a bit of a hand in it because they were in touch with the CPE Bach edition people at the Packard Humanities Institute, and I sort of set them up and made some connections so that they could get the sheet music and do these things. And one of the things they wanted to record were the Hamburg symphonies. And they had, who was it? Wolfram Christ, the violist, who's now a conductor, also is an excellent conductor, a fine musician, and the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra to do the Hamburg symphonies, which were just for strings. And they were those wonderful pieces that Baron von Schweten, commissioned from CPE Bach, and said, just do whatever you want. They don't have to be practical. Just do it. And CPE Bach did. Well, there had been many recordings of them, or several recordings of them anyway, on period instruments with harpsichord continuos, which I thought sounded just dreadful. The strings were horrible, and the continuo was too prominent and overly annoying. And if you looked at, I had the score. I mean, if you look what C.P. Bach wrote, he's very, very careful. I mean, he writes out everything, and everything is detailed, and the dynamics are exquisitely detailed. And it's very difficult to write PP to FF on a harpsichord, even one with two manuals, to have the kind of dynamic range that blends properly with the ensemble and all. And these days, these continuo players are usually the conductors of the ensemble, and they can't resist mugging and embellishing and turning the works into harpsichord concertos. I mean, it was driving me nuts. So I suggested to my buddy, Dr. Zerlenmeyer Eller in Munich, who was producing these things, he was making these recordings, that they consider using a forte piano instead of a harpsichord. Because Tovey had been writing about how, a piano can do everything a harpsichord can do, basically, and even better as a continuo instrument because it can vary its dynamics and blend properly with the ensemble and not have the harmonic filler take precedence over, like, the tune and all of that. And he was right. He's absolutely right from an aesthetic point of view. It wasn't correct from a historical perspective, but from a musical perspective, yes. And so I said, use a forte piano. And let's see what it sounds like. Well, they did. And it sounded fabulous. And I gave it a fabulous review, of course. But it sounds amazing. So if you haven't heard it, it's the C.P.E. Bach Hamburg Symphonies on Hensler with the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra and Wolfram Christ conducting. Really, really great sounding. Give it a listen. Anyway, so they did it that way. Well, word got out they were doing it that way, and I was getting some reports back from my buddies that people in the period instrument movement were hysterical because they were using a forte piano instead of a harpsichord. And it generated, it's a tempest in a teapot, 60 seconds possibly of controversy, but it was controversial. And people had really strong ideas about what you had to do and you should do and couldn't do and all that. it was very interesting to actually see the reaction because of this. And none of this had any real basis in reality. What we need to understand is that underneath that little tip of the iceberg that we see is the seething mass of supposed period instrument expert musicians looking for work. And they're the same crew of backstabbing bitches and entitled babies that we find everywhere else in the performing arts universe. And I say that with love. I do. I mean, but behind all of the aesthetic arguments, there is the harsh reality that people want attention. They want to make a living. There is a money question. Everything comes down to a money question in the performing arts, whether they admit it or not. It's usually about money. And so you have keyboard people who play all of these instruments, and some of them are extraordinary, but you cannot prevent the public or the music industry from promoting soloists who sell records or who sell concert seats. And they're going to be playing normal instruments. There is a huge, do you think Steinway and Columbia Artist Management and these classical equivalent of mega corporations who have every artist who you recognize locked up, Baldwin, whatever, Bosendorfer, all these great piano manufacturers who also have quite a pedigree going back hundreds of years. They've got all these people signed up and those are their artists, and they're going to say that it's illegitimate to play that instrument, that repertoire, Bach or Scarlatti, on their instrument. It's never going to happen. Never in a billion years. Whether it's right or wrong, there is a huge infrastructure which is devoted to promoting soloists playing modern instruments. And it's not going anywhere. And that's a good thing. It's a very good thing, because people who play harpsichords are different from people who play pianos, essentially. There just isn't a harpsichord infrastructure like there's a piano infrastructure. And so there is a very, very different type of promotion that goes on. But, they exist side by side, unlike the violinists. Because a violin is a violin. A violin by Stradivarius is still being played today, maybe modified somewhat, but it's the same violin. So you can't have two independent schools existing harmoniously and separately. In the keyboard world, you've got different keyboard instruments played by different artists and different people promoting them. And so you have that possibility of there being both coexisting to a certain degree, but one not challenging the supremacy of the existing, instrumental categories. So that, I think, is part of the answer of this absolutely fascinating question. I think it's a great, great question. And I think that also one of the things we're seeing now, of course, is that modern ensembles, especially chamber orchestras with modern instruments, are mixing up modern and period instruments, and they're adopting some of the precepts of period instrument performance practice, some of which are good, some of which are stupid, and we know which ones they are. We're not going into that, but it's all sifting out. But I think this viewer was very perceptive in pointing out that the issue was largely with the orchestral sound. That's what was being sold as particularly authentic. That's what people were listening to or expecting. That was the opening that modern orchestras left for the period instrument people to step through, the doorway they were able to step through and reclaim a great deal of repertoire. And it cannot and will never happen when it comes to solo performance, for the reasons that I've described. So thank you so much for asking that question. I hope I've been able to answer it somewhat and give you a little insight into what's going on out there in the real world. It's very, very interesting. I really do. It was like a revelation to me to have someone ask that question, because I'd never thought of it that way. And I'm so happy that you provided that perspective and that we could share some thoughts about it. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep asking those questions. I'm happy to answer them to the extent of my ability. Take care.